In 1998, a brief encounter in Missouri turned deadly when Gary Black fatally stabbed Jason Johnson over a dispute involving Black's girlfriend. What started as a simple altercation spiraled into a years-long legal battle, 2 trials, and a life behind bars. This is the story of a violent act that changed lives in an instant. If you're into true crime stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more cases just like this one. Gary Black was born on July 19, 1950. He grew up in Missouri, where he spent most of his life before the tragic events that unfolded in 1998. Little is known about his early childhood, but by the time of the crime, Black had accumulated a significant criminal record. His prior history with the law includes multiple run-ins with authorities, spanning various offenses that paint a picture of a man who had struggled with staying on the right side of the law. Before the stabbing of Jason Johnson, Black had already been in and out of prison several times. His criminal past included violent crimes, which likely contributed to his aggressive reaction during the incident in question. These earlier offenses suggest that Black had a pattern of resorting to violence when faced with conflicts, and this history would play a critical role in understanding why the situation escalated so quickly on that fateful night in October 1998. While details of his earlier crimes remain sparse, it's clear that Black had a history of confrontations and an inability to de-escalate tense situations. This is important context when examining the events that unfolded between him, his girlfriend Tammy Lawson, and Jason Johnson. Black's violent past, combined with a volatile personality, may have predisposed him to react in an extreme manner when he felt his relationship was threatened. His background also shaped his interactions with the justice system. Having been through the system before, Black was no stranger to legal proceedings, and this familiarity would later come into play as he navigated the trials and appeals that followed his conviction for murder. His past offenses and experiences with law enforcement likely influenced his actions after the crime as well, including his attempt to flee the state and his efforts to evade capture. The events that led to the fatal stabbing of Jason Johnson were not the result of a one-time incident of violence, but rather a culmination of years of criminal behavior and unresolved anger issues. Black's criminal history provides crucial insight into the mindset he carried with him on that night, revealing a man with a history of quick tempers, violent tendencies, and a familiarity with life on the wrong side of the law. While Gary Black's upbringing and early life remain largely undocumented, his past criminal record serves as a significant piece of the puzzle when trying to understand why a seemingly minor altercation escalated into a deadly encounter. His background of previous violent encounters shows a man who, when placed in a situation where he felt cornered or threatened, was more likely to respond with aggression. This context helps explain how a brief encounter at a convenience store could spiral into such a tragic outcome. Ultimately, Gary Black's history of criminal activity set the stage for the events that would unfold in Joplin, Missouri, leading to the death of Jason Johnson and Black's eventual life sentence in prison. Jason Johnson, the victim in this tragic case, was a 28-year-old man living in Joplin, Missouri. Not much is publicly documented about Johnson's personal life, but from the accounts that have surfaced, he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the night of October 2, 1998, Jason Johnson crossed paths with Gary Black and Tammy Lawson at a convenience store, a moment that would turn deadly within hours. Tammy Lawson played a central role in the events that led to the fatal altercation. She was Gary Black's girlfriend at the time, and it was her interaction with Jason Johnson that set everything in motion. Tammy, who was with Black at the convenience store, was allegedly the recipient of unwanted attention from Johnson. According to Black's account, Jason Johnson made a pass at Tammy, which immediately provoked Black's anger. While no physical altercation occurred inside the store, the tension between the three individuals was palpable. Tammy Lawson's relationship with Gary Black adds further context to the night's events. Black, a man with a history of violent behavior, was reportedly highly protective and even possessive of Lawson. Their relationship dynamic played a significant role in how Black perceived the situation. To him, Johnson's interaction with Tammy was not just a minor inconvenience, but a threat to his relationship, and possibly a challenge to his masculinity. This perception would soon lead to a series of aggressive actions. After leaving the convenience store, Jason Johnson likely had no idea that he was being followed. Tammy and Gary, still angry about the earlier exchange, decided to follow Johnson in their vehicle. What might have been a situation that could have de-escalated turned deadly as they pursued him. It's important to note that Tammy, while present during this pursuit, did not physically participate in the attack, but her presence and Gary's reaction to her role in the situation fueled the escalating aggression. As Johnson drove away, Tammy and Black followed closely behind him, a pursuit that culminated at a stoplight. At this point, the tension from the earlier interaction had fully boiled over. Gary Black, driven by a mixture of anger and jealousy, decided to confront Johnson directly. He exited his vehicle and approached Johnson's car. Within moments, what had started as a minor verbal altercation turned into a deadly confrontation. Black stabbed Johnson in the neck, inflicting a fatal wound that would ultimately take Johnson's life 3 days later. Tammy Lawson's role in the events that unfolded was indirect but pivotal. Her presence at the convenience store sparked the initial conflict, and her relationship with Gary Black likely influenced his decision to follow Johnson. Although she didn't participate in the actual stabbing, Tammy's involvement in the night's events cannot be overlooked. She later became a key witness, offering testimony that helped piece together the timeline of events leading up to the murder. While Jason Johnson and Tammy Lawson didn't know each other before that fateful night, their brief encounter set off a chain reaction that ended in tragedy. Johnson, by all accounts, was simply going about his evening when an ill-fated interaction with Lawson brought him into the path of Gary Black's violent tendencies. This chance meeting at a convenience store ultimately became the catalyst for a violent act that would claim Johnson's life and send Gary Black to prison for the rest of his. On the night of October 2, 1998, in the small city of Joplin, Missouri, a chance encounter at a convenience store led to a deadly confrontation. Jason Johnson, a 28-year-old man, entered the store with no indication that his life would soon take a tragic turn. Inside the store, he crossed paths with Gary Black and his girlfriend Tammy Lawson. What happened next is central to the events that followed. According to accounts from that night, Jason Johnson allegedly made a pass at Tammy Lawson while they were all inside the store. The exact nature of this interaction remains unclear, but it's been reported that Johnson's comment or gesture toward Tammy upset both her and Gary Black. To Black, this moment felt like a personal insult, an affront to his relationship with Tammy, and it immediately triggered a deep sense of anger. However, rather than confronting Johnson at the store, the trio left without any major altercation. It seemed as though the tension might dissipate. Unfortunately, this was far from the case. As Johnson left the convenience store in his vehicle, he may have thought that the brief exchange was behind him. But for Gary Black and Tammy Lawson, the incident was far from over. Fueled by anger, Black made a fateful decision. He and Tammy followed Johnson in their car. This was not a coincidence or a random pursuit. It was a deliberate act. The pair trailed Johnson as he drove through Joplin, maintaining a close distance and building tension with every passing mile. At some point during the pursuit, Johnson, likely unaware of the potential danger he was in, stopped his car at a red light. It was here, at this stoplight, that the simmering anger reached its breaking point. With both vehicles stopped, Gary Black saw his opportunity to confront Johnson face to face. He exited his car, approaching Johnson's vehicle. What started as a verbal altercation quickly escalated into something far more violent. Gary Black, armed with a knife, walked up to Jason Johnson's car. In an instant, what had been a tense but non-physical confrontation turned deadly. Black reached through the window of Johnson's vehicle and stabbed him in the neck. The blade pierced deeply, delivering a wound that would ultimately prove fatal. Johnson, critically injured, was unable to defend himself or escape the attack. Gary Black, having unleashed his violent anger, returned to his vehicle and fled the scene with Tammy Lawson by his side. Jason Johnson, left gravely wounded, managed to survive the initial attack but was in critical condition. Emergency services were called and Johnson was rushed to the hospital for treatment. Despite the efforts of medical professionals, the injury was severe. The knife wound to his neck had caused irreversible damage. After 3 days of fighting for his life, Jason Johnson succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced dead on October 5, 1998. The events of that night were senseless and tragic. What began as a brief interaction in a convenience store escalated into a deadly act of violence fueled by Gary Black's anger and possessiveness. The decision to follow Jason Johnson, confront him at a stoplight, and then stab him in the neck was not just an impulsive reaction, it was a conscious act that would end Johnson's life and alter Black's forever. As soon as Jason Johnson was found critically injured, local law enforcement began their investigation. Johnson was able to survive for 3 days in the hospital, but he was unable to provide any crucial information about his attacker. However, witnesses at the convenience store, along with Tammy Lawson's eventual cooperation, helped police piece together the events of that night. They learned about the confrontation at the store, the pursuit, and most importantly, the identity of the attacker, Gary Black. Black by this point had crossed state lines into Oklahoma. It didn't take long for law enforcement to track him down, as Black's attempt to evade capture was cut short just days after the stabbing. Authorities in Oklahoma arrested him without major incident, and he was quickly brought back to Missouri to face justice for his crime. This swift arrest marked the beginning of a long legal battle that would eventually see Black sentenced for first-degree murder. While Black's arrest was crucial, the evidence gathered by investigators would be key to securing his conviction. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the murder weapon itself. Black had used a 6-inch knife to stab Jason Johnson, and after fleeing the scene, he discarded the weapon in an attempt to cover his tracks. However, Tammy Lawson, likely feeling the weight of the situation, cooperated with police and led them to the location where the weapon was hidden. The knife was found near a cemetery in Joplin, not far from the crime scene, further tying Black to the murder. This recovery of the murder weapon was a pivotal moment in the investigation, as it provided physical evidence of Black's role in the attack. Additionally, investigators found another critical piece of evidence, an empty knife sheath located in Gary Black's car. This discovery further connected Black to the crime, as it showed that he had been carrying the weapon with him that night. The sheath matched the recovered knife, leaving little doubt that Black had been in possession of the murder weapon when he confronted and stabbed Jason Johnson. With the recovery of both the murder weapon and the sheath, the case against Gary Black became significantly stronger. These items, combined with witness testimony and Lawson's cooperation, gave prosecutors the evidence they needed to charge Black with first-degree murder. The fact that Black had attempted to flee, coupled with his efforts to hide the knife, demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt. These actions, alongside the physical evidence, would play a central role in the trial that followed. As the investigation unfolded back in Joplin, police worked quickly to gather information. Witnesses at the convenience store where the initial confrontation occurred, combined with Tammy Lawson's eventual cooperation, helped police identify Black as the primary suspect. Lawson's involvement became particularly significant as she was with Black during the entire incident, from the convenience store altercation to the fatal stabbing at the stoplight. Her testimony played a crucial role in piecing together the events of that night and tracking Black's movements after the crime. Law enforcement's search for Gary Black led them to Oklahoma, where he had fled in hopes of escaping prosecution. However, he didn't remain at large for long. Within days of the crime, authorities in Oklahoma apprehended Black without incident. His arrest marked the end of his brief attempt to run and the beginning of his journey through the legal system. Black was extradited back to Missouri to face charges for the murder of Jason Johnson. While Black's arrest was a critical turning point in the case, the physical evidence collected by investigators solidified the charges against him. One of the most important pieces of evidence was the murder weapon itself. Black had used a 6-inch knife to fatally stab Jason Johnson in the neck. After the attack, Black tried to dispose of the weapon in an attempt to cover his tracks and distance himself from the crime. However, Tammy Lawson, who had been present throughout the incident, cooperated with police after Black's arrest and led them to the location where the knife was discarded. The murder weapon was recovered near a cemetery in Joplin, providing investigators with crucial physical evidence that linked Black to the crime. The recovery of the knife wasn't the only piece of evidence that tied Black to the murder. Investigators also found an empty knife sheath in Black's car, which matched the weapon used in the attack. This piece of evidence was significant because it further established that Black had been carrying the knife with him during the confrontation with Johnson. The presence of the sheath in his vehicle served as a direct connection between Black and the murder weapon, leaving little doubt about his role in the crime. Together, the recovery of the murder weapon and the knife sheath played a pivotal role in the case against Gary Black. These pieces of evidence, combined with witness testimony and the timeline of events provided by Tammy Lawson, painted a clear picture of what had transpired on the night of October 2nd. Black's decision to flee the state, along with his efforts to hide the weapon, demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt, further strengthening the prosecution's case. In 1999, less than a year after the fatal stabbing of Jason Johnson, Gary Black stood trial for first-degree murder in a Missouri courtroom. The prosecution's case against Black was strong, backed by physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and Black's own actions, including his attempt to flee to Oklahoma after the crime. The evidence was clear. Black had followed Jason Johnson after a confrontation at a convenience store, approached him at a stoplight, and stabbed him in the neck with a 6-inch knife, leading to Johnson's death 3 days later. These facts, combined with the recovery of the murder weapon and a matching knife sheath found in Black's car, painted a damning picture of his guilt. The prosecution argued that this was not a crime of passion or self-defense, but a deliberate act of murder. Black had pursued Johnson after the initial altercation, driven by anger and jealousy. At the stoplight, with no immediate threat to his life, Black chose to approach Johnson's vehicle and inflict a fatal wound, proving the intent required for a first-degree murder charge. The prosecution's narrative was clear. This was a premeditated act of violence. Gary Black's defense, however, sought to downplay the intent behind his actions. While specifics of his defense arguments are not widely documented, it is likely that Black's legal team tried to argue that the stabbing was a result of provocation, or that Black acted in a fit of rage, not with premeditated intent. They may have attempted to challenge the idea that Black had planned to kill Jason Johnson, perhaps framing the incident as an escalation that spiraled out of control. Nonetheless, given the evidence against Black, these arguments were insufficient to convince the jury. After a thorough presentation of evidence, the jury found Gary Black guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict reflected their agreement with the prosecution's assertion that Black's actions were intentional and calculated. With the conviction secured, the trial moved to the sentencing phase, where the jury was tasked with determining the appropriate punishment for Black. In Missouri, first-degree murder can carry the ultimate penalty, death. During the sentencing phase, the jury weighed the aggravating factors surrounding the case, including the deliberate nature of the killing and Black's prior criminal record, which indicated a pattern of violent behavior. These factors likely contributed to their decision to sentence Gary Black to death. The jury's recommendation was clear. Black's crime warranted the most severe punishment under the law. In 2004, the Missouri Supreme Court reviewed Black's case in response to his post-conviction relief petition. After carefully examining the trial proceedings and legal arguments, the court identified procedural issues that warranted further scrutiny. Specifically, there were concerns about the fairness of Black's initial trial, particularly with regard to the handling of certain evidence and potential issues with jury instructions. These factors raised enough doubt for the Missouri Supreme Court to grant post-conviction relief, which effectively overturned Black's conviction and death sentence from 1999. This decision did not absolve Black of the crime, but it meant that he would be granted a new trial. The court's decision to grant post-conviction relief was a significant development for Gary Black, as it opened the door for him to potentially challenge the evidence against him and avoid the death penalty. However, the state of Missouri was determined to seek justice for the murder of Jason Johnson, and a second trial was quickly set in motion. In 2006, Gary Black was once again put on trial for the first-degree murder of Jason Johnson. This new trial, like the first, focused on the events of October 2, 1998, when Black followed Johnson and fatally stabbed him in the neck. The prosecution once again presented the overwhelming evidence against Black, the testimony of witnesses, the recovery of the murder weapon, and Black's own actions in fleeing the state after the crime. All of this pointed to a premeditated and deliberate act of murder. Black's defense team, in the second trial, likely attempted to reintroduce arguments about Black's mental state and the circumstances surrounding the stabbing. They may have argued that Black acted in a moment of rage rather than with premeditation. However, as in the first trial, these arguments were insufficient to sway the jury. The evidence against Black remained compelling, and the basic facts of the case had not changed. After hearing the arguments from both sides, the jury once again found Gary Black guilty of first-degree murder. This second conviction reaffirmed Black's role in Jason Johnson's death and reinforced the earlier findings from the 1999 trial. Despite the procedural issues that had led to the overturning of the first conviction, the core facts of the case remained the same, and Black's responsibility for the murder was undeniable. With the conviction secured, the case moved to the sentencing phase. Just as they had done in 1999, the prosecution sought the death penalty, citing the deliberate and violent nature of the crime, as well as Black's history of criminal behavior. The jury agreed, and Gary Black was once again sentenced to death. This marked the second time that Black had been sentenced to die for the murder of Jason Johnson. By 2010, the Missouri Supreme Court once again took up Black's case, this time focusing specifically on his sentencing. While his conviction for the murder of Jason Johnson remained intact, the court found enough reason to revisit the issue of Black's death sentence. After carefully examining the arguments and the proceedings from the 2006 trial, the Missouri Supreme Court identified concerns about how the sentencing phase was conducted. These concerns centered around the fairness of the process and whether the jury had been properly guided in determining whether Black should face the death penalty or an alternative sentence. In light of these findings, the Missouri Supreme Court made the decision to overturn Gary Black's death sentence in 2010. This ruling was a significant moment in Black's legal journey. Although his conviction for first-degree murder remained upheld, the overturning of his death sentence meant that Black would no longer face execution. Instead, the court's ruling paved the way for a new sentencing hearing to determine the appropriate punishment for his crime. During this new sentencing phase, the prosecution no longer sought the death penalty. Instead, the focus shifted to determining whether Black should spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole, or if some other sentence might be considered. Given the brutal nature of the crime and Black's previous criminal history, the prosecution argued that life in prison without parole was the only fitting sentence for a man who had taken another person's life in such a violent and deliberate manner. The court agreed, and in 2010, Gary Black was formally resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This new sentence ensured that Black would spend the remainder of his days behind bars with no chance of release. The decision brought a final resolution to the legal proceedings that had been ongoing for more than a decade, marking the end of Black's appeals and challenges to his sentence. For the family of Jason Johnson, this new sentence may have brought some degree of closure, knowing that Black would never walk free again. While the death penalty was no longer on the table, life in prison without parole ensured that Black would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life, paying the price for the violent act he committed back in 1998. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more true crime content, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We've got plenty more cases to dive into, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. See you in the next one.